In December 1995, a two-time world champion got on a bus in Newcastle, went home to a council flat in Kirkcaldy, and spent the next 17 years refusing to open the door. Bobby George tried to visit him. Eric Bristow tried to visit him. Both were turned away on the doorstep, and what drove Jocky Wilson into that room is not what most darts fans think it was. The toothless grin, the vodka, the falling off a stage in 1984, all of it became the cartoon that buried the man, and the parts of his life that got buried with it are the parts that change how you see him completely. John Thomas Wilson arrived on the 22nd of March 1950 in Kirkcaldy, on the east coast of Fife. The childhood that followed sits documented sparingly because Wilson himself rarely spoke about it. What sits on the record is that he spent part of his early years in a children's home in Fife, served briefly and unsuccessfully in the British Army, and then cycled through a string of working-class jobs around Kirkcaldy, including coal labour, fish processing, and general manual work. Unemployment and dim prospects defined his life when, in 1979, he pocketed £500 at a Butlins holiday camp darts tournament, and that single result set everything else in motion. Within 3 years, the man would be world champion. The 1982 Embassy World Championship ran from the 5th to the 14th of January at Jolly's Cabaret Club in Stoke-on-Trent. Wilson came through Alan Evans 2-1 in the second round, dispatched Bobby George 4-1 in the semi-finals, and then faced John Lowe for the title. He won. During that final, 4 checkouts above 100 came off his board, the numbers being 144, 101, 116 and 141. A closing display nobody who watched it ever forgot. The headline ran bigger than the trophy itself because Wilson became the first Scotsman ever to win the World Darts Championship. The same year he claimed the world title, the BDO suspended him for several months for insulting behaviour towards an official, and that contradiction, world champion and disciplinary case in the same calendar year, defined the pattern of his entire career. The image that came with it was already fixed by then. Short and stocky, missing most of his teeth, visibly chain-smoking and drinking between throws, Wilson looked exactly like what darts historian Patrick Chaplin called the archetypal bloke from the pub darts team who goes on to be champion of the world, short, overweight, toothless, and smoking and drinking between throws. That description was not exaggerated. Bobby George, who shared hotel rooms with him on tour, later wrote that Wilson used to smoke 20 cigarettes in bed at night, waking up every 15 or 20 minutes to strike a match, take half a puff, go back to sleep, and snore like hell. The smoke would get so bad you couldn't see the toilet door. On the drinking, George kept it just as direct, recalling that Wilson would have 3/4 of a pint of vodka and just top it up with Coke, and he'd drink it like beer. Sid Waddell, who commentated on most of his career, put a number on it. Wilson's typical intake at his peak, Waddell explained, ran to 10 pints of lager and the 3 or 4 vodkas every single night. Add to that around 50 cigarettes a day, type 2 diabetes, and a relationship with money so careless it became its own folklore. His friend Jimmy Skirving once described it like this: "See the amount of trophies he won and gave away. I can assure you, Jocky was taken a loan of quite a lot. Once he won a holiday and a nest of suitcases. He never got home with either. He sold the holiday for 50 quid and the cases for a tenner." That was the man who, by 1982, had become the most famous darts player in Britain. On the 30th of September 1982, Dexys Midnight Runners performed their new single, On Top of the Pops. Their song, Van Morrison's Jocky Wilson Said, took its name from the American soul singer of the same name. Hung as the onstage backdrop directly behind Kevin Rowland was an enormous photograph of Jocky Wilson, the darts player. For decades, the standard version of the story claimed that BBC props had pulled the wrong photo. Jocky instead of Jackie, but that version is wrong. Kevin Rowland has confirmed in multiple later interviews that the band did it on purpose, as a deliberate visual gag. The effect proved immediate and permanent. Overnight, Wilson stopped being a darts star and became a national pop culture figure, recognised by people who had never watched a single tournament but knew the toothless grin instantly. The phrase, "Jocky Wilson said," entered British cultural shorthand and was eventually used as the title of a Scottish stage play and a BBC Scotland documentary about him. It is the single most cited cultural moment of his career, and it had nothing to do with darts. The story of Wilson's career cannot be told without Eric Bristow. The two of them headlined 1980s British darts, the Cockney five-time world champion against the working-class Scot, and the BBC leaned into the contrast for everything it was worth. What the cameras never showed was that the rivalry in private was a friendship. The most famous incident between them happened at the WDF World Cup in Edinburgh on the 21st and 22nd of October, 1983. Just before the singles final walk-on, Wilson ran at Bristow and kicked him hard in the shin, drawing blood. By Bristow's own account, the kick took about 2 inches of skin. Bristow grabbed him by the throat, officials separated them, and Wilson's explanation, delivered as he was being pulled away, became one of the most quoted lines in darts history. "I've got to try to beat you somehow." Bristow won the match 4-2, and the two of them went to the bar together afterwards. 2 years before that, in 1981, the men had been on an exhibition tour in Newcastle upon Tyne. Wilson was sharing a hotel room with Bobby George and another player, Alan Glazier, and during that night, George ruptured his spleen. Wilson was the one who noticed something was seriously wrong and got him medical help. George spent 5 weeks in hospital, and the doctors told him afterwards he had nearly died. That is the side of Wilson the caricature missed. By the mid-1980s, the lifestyle had begun catching up with him. Real broadcast footage exists of Wilson, visibly drunk, falling at the conclusion of a 1984 Lakeside semi-final. He lost 5-6 against Dave Whitcomb, and the clip is widely circulated. It often gets cited as the incident that triggered the BDO's on-stage alcohol ban, but that timeline is wrong. The alcohol ban did not take effect until the 1st of January 1989. The first World Championship under that new rule was the 1989 Embassy. There were no pints on the table. Bristow by then was 3 years into a condition called dartitis, a near paralysis of the throwing arm he could not control. Onset had hit him at the Swedish Open in November 1986, aged 29, with 5 World Championships already in his cabinet. He described it himself like this: "Your brain is saying, for Christ's sake, let the thing go, and your arm won't go anywhere. It's embarrassing." Bristow would never win another world title. Wilson met him in the final at Lakeside Country Club, Frimley Green, and raced into a 5-0 lead in sets. Bristow fought back to 5-4. Wilson held him off and won 6-4. £20,000 went home with Wilson that night, a winner's cheque so significant for that era that no BDO World Championship payout would meaningfully drop below it for almost 3 decades. More importantly, the win made him a 2-time world champion, and it was also the last great moment of his career. On the 7th of January 1993, Wilson was one of 16 players who walked out of the BDO and formed the World Darts Council, the breakaway tour that became the PDC. He played on through the new circuit, including a 240-point visit against John Lowe at the 1993 Skoll World Match Play, but the trajectory was already pointing downward. In December 1995, without an announcement, without an interview, and without a farewell tour, Jocky Wilson boarded a bus in Newcastle and went home to Kirkcaldy. The man never played again. A one-bedroom council flat on Melrose Crescent, on the same housing estate where he had grown up, became his home for the rest of his life. He refused to leave, and he turned away nearly every visitor who tried. Both Bobby George and Eric Bristow attempted, separately, to come and see him, and both were turned away at the door. Bankruptcy followed in 1997. The career that had peaked at around £60,000 a year in combined earnings was gone, drained by a costly legal dispute with his first manager, by HMRC, and by his own habits. And for the next 16 years, he survived on disability allowance. Recognition came back to him in 2009 when the PDC created the Jocky Wilson Cup, a Scotland versus England team event named in his honour while he was still alive. Wilson declined to attend the inaugural night. Instead, a recorded message went out to the crowd, 6 words long. "Hi, this is Jocky. Sorry I can't be with you tonight." That was the last time most people in the darts world heard his voice. Jocky Wilson died on the 24th of March 2012, 2 days after his 62nd birthday, in the same flat on Melrose Crescent. The reported cause was respiratory failure, against a background of heavy lifelong smoking, diabetes, and chronic respiratory decline. Tributes came from the people who had actually been there. The week after his death, the McCoy's Premier League held a 2-minute applause in Week 8, with on-screen tributes from Phil Taylor and Rod Harrington. Bobby George wrote that he was bidding, "Farewell, John Thomas Jocky Wilson. We had some great times together. I will never forget you and your toothless grin." Eric Bristow's verdict on him, written years earlier, ran to 3 words: a one-off. Sid Waddell, who had commentated on more of his matches than anyone, put it more bluntly when he said that Wilson couldn't be Jocky Wilson without a lot of drink. He couldn't be the player he was. Unfortunately, the 10 pints of lager and the 3 or 4 vodkas are going to kill you if you do it every night. That prediction held, but it is not the whole story either. The image the 1980s left behind, drunk, toothless, falling off a stage, came from real footage. None of it was fabricated, it just was never the full picture. The full picture is a man from a children's home in Fife who beat John Lowe to win his first world title at 31. A man who in 1981 noticed his roommate was dying and saved his life. A man who, in private, drank with the rival the cameras told you he hated. A man whose face ended up on Top of the Pops because the lead singer of one of the biggest bands in Britain thought it would be funny. A man who beat a 5-time world champion in his last great final, walked away from the sport at Christmas 1995 and spent the next 17 years refusing to be a celebrity. Wilson was the first Scot to win the World Darts Championship. He won it twice, and almost nothing about how he is remembered today is quite the way it actually happened.